Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examined Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. So, this week, as I said before, I'm going to be talking about an issue and problem called Scientism. I think it relates, although maybe not directly, but it relates to this ongoing series I've been doing on creation, science, and evolution, as it helps explain a lot of the argumentation around these issues. It helps explain some of the worldview issues and background stuff that's going on when people are arguing about evolution and creation and things like that. So I'll get into that, but before I do, just a couple of housekeeping notes. I'm still looking for somebody to represent the young Earth creation position on this podcast here. I've reached out to several people who have all ignored me or said no. Some of them had said no politely, one person was a little rude, and I'm just needing some help getting somebody on the podcast who can present the young Earth creation viewpoint here. I'm not sure why they're turning me down so much. I'm willing to give them as much of a fair hearing as I gave David Pullman and Michael Jones. And since it's a viewpoint that Christians take on this issue, I think it's something that should be explored and looked at and critiqued, just as I've attempted to explore, look at, and critique the other viewpoints. So if any of the young Earth creation people are thinking I'm going to present them unfairly, I'm certainly not going to try to. So if you're aware of anyone who can come on and advocate for young Earth creationism, who's willing to talk about it, let me know. If you yourself are somebody who can advocate for young Earth creationism and you've got some education or credentials in that, like in philosophy, theology, or one of the relevant sciences, and you'd be willing to do that, send me a message and let me know, because I'd certainly be willing to hear you out. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do here, is hear people out. So a further note here is that I'd mentioned before that I'm going to be doing a debate with David Van Beber on the issue of inerrancy and how Christians should understand the nature of inerrancy and what that means. If you want to know more of what I think about that, go back and look at the podcast episode where I talked about 2 points on inerrancy, and then the next week thereafter where I had a great discussion with Father Randy Soto on Catholic positions on inerrancy. And so that debate has actually been pushed back. We originally had it scheduled for December the 2nd, and now it's going to be pushed back to January the 6th. And the reason, which is very exciting, is we're not going to do this debate strictly online. We're actually getting a live venue in the Springfield area at one of the libraries there. The details are still being a little set up, but it'll be in the evening of January the 6th. And if you live in the area around Springfield, Missouri, you can come see us do it live. Of course, we'll record it and put it up later because he runs his own podcast as well, and we're both going to air it. But you can come see us do it live, and I'm sure there'll be time for questions and answers afterwards. It should be a fun, good time. David and I have met for coffee and talked about these things, and he's a cordial gentleman, so even though we have substantive disagreements, we should be able to have a good, edifying exchange where both of us come out the other side better for it. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm very excited about engaging with David in that way, and I know he's excited about it too. It'll be a lot of fun. So before I get into the problems and issues surrounding scientism, I want to give out another Facepalm and Sigh award. And it's no longer the Facepalm and Sigh award of the week because, well, I don't do it every week. So now it's just the Facepalm and Sigh award. And this week, I'm giving it out to a woman named Joy Pullman, who wrote an article at thefederalist.com. Now, The Federalist tends to be a relatively conservative-leaning editorial group, and most of the time I actually like what they write there, or at least I'm in principle in agreement with most of the positions and arguments and editorials they write there. They do have some pretty good content. It's worth your time checking out. But anyhow, Joy, or Miss or Mrs. Pullman, I'm not sure, so I'll just call her Joy. Anyhow, she wrote an article that she titled, First Common Core High School Grads Worst Prepared for College in 15 Years. Now, this is a pretty well-written article. It's well-researched and cited, and that she's actually working with a lot of data, but the tagline of it tells you the gist of what you need to know about the article. This is the opposite of what we were told would happen with trillions of taxpayer dollars and an entire generation of children who deserve not to be guinea pigs in a failed national experiment, i.e. she's arguing against Common Core. And I'll just read you out a little bit of the article here. For the third time in a row since Common Core was fully phased in nationwide, U.S. student test scores on the nation's broadest and most respected test have dropped, a reversal of an upward trend between 1990 and 2015. Further, the class of 2019, the first to experience all 4 high school years under Common Core, is the worst prepared for college in 15 years, according to a new report. And she goes on and cites the report. She cites various data that's demonstrating that test scores are going down, and explains why these test scores are pretty accurate, or at least the best we're going to be able to do with regard to measuring education. And then she goes on and defines Common Core as a set of national instructions and testing mandates implemented starting in 2010 without approval from nearly any legislative body and over waves of bipartisan citizen protest. President Obama, his education secretary, former Florida Governor George Bush, Bill Gates, and a myriad of other self-described education reformers promised Common Core would do exactly the opposite of what has happened: improve U.S. student achievement. As Common Core was moving into schools, 69% of school principals said they also thought it would improve student achievement. All these experts were wrong, wrong, wrong. And she quotes the Education Secretary Betsy DeVos as saying these are devastating results. And skipping ahead a little bit in the article here, she also goes on to say, well, of course, many factors go into student achievement. It's very clear from the available information that U.S. teachers and schools worked hard to do what Common Core demanded, and that, regardless, their efforts have not yielded good results. A 2016 survey, for example, found more than 3/4 of teachers, 76%, reported having changed at least half of their classroom instruction as a result of Common Core. Almost 1/5, 19%, reported having changed almost all of it. And a very interesting point in the article here, she cites a poll that was done in October, and I assume October of this year, because this article came out on October 31st of 2019. She says this October poll of registered voters across the country found 52% think their local public schools are excellent or good, although 55% thought the U.S. public school system as a whole is either just fair or poor. And that's an interesting dynamic there that you actually see reflected in Congress as well, where you ask people their general opinion of Congress, it's very, very low. Their approval rating is, I think, routinely in the teens. You ask people what they think of their own congressperson, and the approval rating is usually much, much higher, 30, 40, 50%, or even higher. And so there's an odd dynamic there where, well, my guy is okay, my school's okay, but the system as a whole is terrible. So I thought that was pretty interesting and fascinating. And so you can go read the article for yourself on the Federalist if you like, but I'll just not bury the lead on this anymore. The error here is she's doing the fallacy of assuming that correlation equals causation, i.e., because Common Core was implemented so heavily across public school systems in the U.S., and student scores are dropping, therefore Common Core is the cause. Now, it may be the cause, but you have to do more than just point to correlation to establish that. That's a very common mistake you see in social science and honestly, in the way the press reports the sciences in general, is that they're going to assume correlation establishes causation. Now, sometimes correlation should encourage you to look for causation. The fact that my head starts hurting after somebody punched me in the head, well, the two of those are probably connected. Almost certainly in that case, in fact. But, maybe I have a metal plate in my head from something that happened years and years ago, and the person punched me in the metal plate, so it didn't hurt me, and I just happened to start getting a headache at the exact same time. Unlikely, but could happen. And that's why assuming correlation establishes causation is generally considered a fallacy, because correlation does not deductively, logically, and necessarily lead to causation. So get away from my kind of foolish headache example and go back to our article. Well, Common Core was implemented, and it has been implemented pretty heavily, and I fully admit I don't know a great deal about that because my kids are too young to be in school, and when it was being implemented, I didn't have any kids at all. So I don't know a great deal about the pros and cons of Common Core. I've heard a lot of people complain about it, but I don't know much about it, so I'm not in a position to evaluate whether it's a good idea or not. But it has been implemented. It has been implemented pretty heavily, and test scores are going down. Now, that should make a reasonable person go, maybe there's something here. However, it should not make you conclude Common Core is driving test scores down. You haven't established that. There's reasonable cause for you to go and explore that in greater detail and try and see if there's some causation there, but you haven't established it yet. There could be a whole myriad of other factors going on. It could be, for example, the rise of the internet and how it's so easy for students to be distracted and bring phones and tablets and things like that with them to school has led to students being more distracted, caring less about school, and that's caused their scores to go down, and it has nothing to do with Common Core. It could be that the home situations of students have generally gotten worse over the last 10 years or so, in that their parents don't care as much, they're not being encouraged to do homework, and so they're not doing as well in school. There's other data I've seen elsewhere that indicates that if you're from a two-parent home and your parents actually stay together and care about you, you're far more likely to do better in school than somebody from a single-parent home or who's been from a home where somebody got divorced and remarried and things like that. There's data that indicates your family life is a very good indicator of how well or poorly you're going to do at school. So maybe that's going on. Or, far more likely is, it's a combination of all these things together. Some part of it is due to Common Core. Some part of it is to do with students getting distracted due to the internet and things and video games and things like that. Some aspect of it is due to home life. I'm reading a book right now about the way boys struggle in school that for another essay I'm working on, and the author of that, who's a medical doctor, suggests that giving kids medicine for attention deficit disorder, especially boys, actually hurts their long-term goals in school, and he's got some data to cite for that, both medical and statistical. So really what you find in the real world is there's usually a combination of many, many different factors. And what Joy or Miss or Mrs. Pullman here was doing is more or less saying, it's Common Core, that's the problem. Well, maybe, maybe not. Maybe you address all those other factors, and then the problem goes away and you realize the problem wasn't Common Core. Maybe Common Core is the primary problem and we should be looking at that. But the real world is not so simple and easy that you can say correlation, therefore causation. The way you'd have to go about it if you wanted to even attempt to establish that Common Core was the problem is you'd have to do something like a controlled study. You'd have to have a control group, a group of kids who aren't doing Common Core, another group of kids who are doing Common Core, and then compare the results over many years. But you'd also have to find ways to control for all these other variables that are going on, like, well, what if these kids are naturally more talented? What if these kids are simply going to a better school? What if these kids have a teacher who really, really cares? And what if these kids have parents who care and these kids don't? And you'd have to control for all those other variables and then compare the two. And the reason why it's difficult, if not impossible, to do a study like that is it's difficult, maybe even impossible, to control for all those other various factors. And that's also the way you typically find the social sciences working, is they're trying to control for all these variables and then compare the control group and the group that's been, well, experiment on is the wrong word here, but I'm sure you see what I'm getting at. And that's why a lot of the social sciences are regarded as a soft science, because you generally just can't control for all those variables, so you can often get to the point in some of these things where you can say, well, it's very, very likely this is the cause, but you can't say for sure it's the cause. So, for example, if you get lung cancer and you've been smoking all your life, it's very, very highly likely smoking was the cause of your lung cancer. Now, it's not a dead certainty, though, because there's some people who've never smoked at all in their lives who get lung cancer, so clearly there's something else going on, too. But enough controlled studies have been done that show smoking dramatically increases your chances of getting lung cancer. So if you've got lung cancer and you were smoking, that's probably what the causation is. Not certain, but very likely. And that's why I'm giving this article the Facepalm and Sigh Award, because it assumes correlation is causation, and it's not the same. That's a logical fallacy. And I'm not sure why I forgot this until this moment, but the name of this fallacy is not correlation is not causation, although that's true. The name of this fallacy is a hasty generalization. I've talked about this type of fallacy here on the podcast before, but it's where you assume a connection too quickly, where you assume causation too quickly. And hopefully after all the talking I just did, you can see why this article does that. And a side note, my guest from a few weeks ago, Peter Razor, he actually posted a link to this on Facebook and pointed it out. And so my thanks to him for pointing this out and pointing me in the direction of the article, because it's a good thing to talk about. And it does kind of loosely tie into this week's topic on the problem of scientism. So hopefully by the end of the podcast, you'll be able to see how it ties in and what I mean there. Okay, so moving on to talk about scientism. Before I really dive into the meat of it here, I want to tell you two quick short stories or experiences I've had that actually do relate quite a bit. So the first one is I like to watch various documentaries on YouTube and things like that because I like to learn things. It's interesting to watch videos that teach you about various obscure facts or where philosophers get on there and argue for various points and things along those lines. So I enjoy doing that. And a while ago, when I was doing that, I stumbled on one that I forget exactly how the title went, but it was something like 8 or 10 anomalies of ancient Egypt that science can't explain. And I like history, especially ancient Egypt. It's fascinating. So I watched it, and I was kind of surprised that the video had pretty much nothing to do with science whatsoever. In fact, the anomalies most of them weren't even anomalies. They were just kind of oddities where the ancient Egyptians did things that we would now look at as bizarre, and no surprise there. But the few things that were anomalies wouldn't fall into the realm of science, at least not science as the video was defining it. Rather, they were in like the realm of history. Or maybe in some cases you could say they were in the realm of archaeology, which is kind of a hybrid of science and history. But they weren't really problems with science. They weren't problems where some guys in a lab were trying to figure out something about ancient Egypt and they mixed up their test tubes and it didn't work. The video was confusing categories, so to speak. And again, I hope as we go through this podcast, you'll see how that's relevant and relates to scientism. The second story is a discussion I was having with somebody a while back who was asking for proof of the resurrection of Christ. Now, I'm not going to identify who this person is or what the group it was in was because I hate things like call-out culture, and that's not the point here. The point is to try to convey to you the mindset this person was working from. So and I'm also not going to quote it verbatim, just try and give you the gist of it. So this person asked, is there a non-biblical record of the resurrection? If Jesus was seen by more than 500 people, why wouldn't we want to see any evidence other than the Bible? At least someone other than the apostles must have written something. And some various people gave some responses, some good, some not so good. A lot of them kind of in the middle, not quite what I would say. So I went on there and responded to him like this. I said, there are extra-biblical sources from within the first 100 to 150 years or so that establish a resurrection is what the early Christians claimed happened. And these are things like the early church fathers, Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny, and so on. And really, given the time period and setting that we're talking about, that's about the best you could expect. Something like a resurrection is necessarily a self-selecting event in that people who don't believe in it are highly likely to ignore or ridicule it, like Tacitus and Pliny did, whereas the people who believe in it are just necessarily going to be advocating for it and claiming that other people should believe in it too. Hence, the only early or contemporary sources you should expect to find for it are going to be from people who believed in it. These would be things like the Gospels, the writings of Paul, the Church Fathers, and so on. Other sources, historians and so on, would be pretty much just ignoring it until Christianity became a large enough force that they had to argue against it, which wasn't until, loosely speaking, 200 or 300 years later. Miraculous and other supernatural claims are quite common in ancient sources, even many of those that are generally regarded as decent history by contemporary historians. The mindset of people then was not the same as it is now. Because supernatural claims were common, there wouldn't be the same desire to go investigate such a claim as there is now, unless you're a person who does believe in the resurrection. And that's more or less what the documentation we do have reflects. The early Christians recorded their claims, their arguments, and their stated evidence for it, and until a couple of generations later, when Christianity started getting fairly popular, pretty much everybody else kind of ignored it. Essentially, you're expecting ancient people to think and behave like contemporary people do. They didn't. And this person responded, then how are we supposed to believe it? In this case, the claim to universality is weakening. I've looked at a few presentations, but they all come from the Bible. How do I know the Bible is written objectively? I guess the only way to know is an experience like Paul's. And I assume there he's referring to Paul's conversion experience on the road to Damascus. And I responded to, again, you just don't find objectivity like you're asking for in anything related to religion, philosophy, theology, and history. You might get close to something like true objectivity in things like math or the hard sciences like geology, chemistry, and astronomy, but you just don't get that type of objectivity anywhere else in life. Anyone who tells you differently simply hasn't studied or thought through the issues enough. And really, even claiming that the hard sciences are objective is pretty controversial, as not most, but at least some philosophers of science will dispute even this. And then I went through and explained how, nonetheless, I think you can give a good abductive or inference to the best explanation argument for the resurrection. It's the same thing I've given before on the podcast the episode I did back on Easter, where I talked about how you can inference to the best explanation proves or at least demonstrates that Christ rose from the dead, and I encourage this guy to check that out. He responded again, "Thanks, I will read. But we are talking about God. God better provide evidence." And so again I responded to him that maybe I don't understand what you mean. There's a great deal of evidence to consider, and much of it is of a much better quality than comparable things. The New Testament is by far the best attested ancient document there is, meaning there's more and better copies of it than there are of any other ancient sources. And when you compare the claims of Christ's resurrection to other ancient claims of miracles, they aren't even in the same ballpark. That is, the other ancient miracles that appear in literature, if you're going to say you're skeptical of Christ's resurrection for whatever reason, well, you've got to be ultra skeptical of the other ones, because there's just no good evidence in favor of them, or at least not near to the quantity that there is for Christ's resurrection. So perhaps I misunderstand you, but it seems like what you're asking for is good evidence that is better. And what else could it be better than evidence for comparable claims? And yet that is what we have. And the gentleman responded again, "Why should I trust the apostles if the nearest Bible is 30 years after Jesus' death?" And the last response I gave him is, "So I take it you are also skeptical of anyone who is currently writing about World War II, as that's more than 30 years ago, and you are even more skeptical of anyone who is currently writing about the American Revolution, as that was much more than 30 years ago." And that was, I guess you could say that was kind of a little bit of a sarcastic response on my part, because I was fully expecting him to say no, and then I would say yes, and the point is there's more things involved in determining whether you should trust a source than the time that it's removed from. There's a lot more details you need to look at. And so I relayed that interaction I had there with you to try to point out that this guy was operating from a mindset where he was transferring the objectivity and demands for hard evidence and hard proof that is appropriate in things like math, geology, astronomy, and some other hard sciences like that. And he was attempting to apply that to claims about history and philosophy and, to some degree, theology, and saying, I can't accept the claims that you're making about the truth of Christ's resurrection, because that's philosophical and theological, unless you can give me the same kind of proof that I see in things like math and geology. And what I was trying to explain to him is it just doesn't work that way. That's not how these things work. You're kind of confusing categories, so to speak. You're demanding a higher standard of proof than is appropriate for this type of inquiry. And I hope the reason why that's a higher standard of proof than you should demand of claims made in history and philosophy is obvious to you. Because if you want to prove a chemical property like when you put hydrogen peroxide and baking soda together, they foam up, like we all did when we were kids, well, that's a repeatable thing. You can do it in a lab, and you can do that for all kinds of other chemical properties and things like that. You can do it over and over and over and over again. You just, by the very nature of what we're talking about, you can't do that with any type of historical claim, whether it's a claim about history or a claim about the American Revolution or a claim about World War II. You can't reproduce the things involved and then go see if the same thing happens again. I've said to people many times before, because I think it's kind of funny, you can't reproduce the conditions under which the ancient Egyptians built the pyramid and just wait and see if they do it again. That's not how history, archaeology works. And that's also not how investigating a claim like Christ rose from the dead works. You can't just go repeat the events of Christ's crucifixion, wait 3 days and see if he rises again. That's not how these things work. And yet this gentleman was, although I don't think he was doing it like maliciously or in a vindictive sense. I think he was just kind of confused as to what standards of evidence and proof he should be looking for there. So I'm telling these two little stories here to illustrate the problem of scientism, because scientism is the idea, loosely speaking, that the sciences, and especially the hard sciences, are the only way to come to legitimate knowledge. So if you can't prove it in the same sense that you can prove math, geology, astronomy, chemistry, then it's not real, or at least it's a lesser type of knowledge. And I think in the case of the gentleman I was talking to, he held the kind of what we would term a weak scientism. That is, it didn't seem to me he was claiming that, well, history and philosophy are bunk. They're you can't prove anything with them, so they're just garbage. Forget about them. Rather, it seemed to me he was more or less falling into the trap of assuming, well, we can prove things in chemistry and geology, but if you can't prove things like that in history and theology, then history and theology are lesser disciplines. I need to demand the same type of evidence from history and theology that I do from chemistry and geology. And so, loosely speaking, that's all scientism really is it's applying science in categories where it doesn't belong. It's assuming that because the scientific method is so successful in things like engineering, chemistry, geology, etc., 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 that then we have to apply it everywhere else. And to some degree, I think you can kind of understand the temptation to do so, because science is pretty successful. It's very, very good at figuring out the hows of many, many different things. And so naturally people want to copy it. That's one of the things that René Descartes was doing when he started his philosophy, is he was looking at the sciences and how they were revolutionizing so many things and thinking, we need to make philosophy more like science because look how successful science is. Now, I think that pushed philosophy in a completely bad direction, but that's for a whole nother podcast maybe sometime in the future. And I think in more popular level way. And the example of that I gave of that YouTube video on Egyptian anomalies kind of demonstrates that, where the people who made that video weren't properly categorizing things. They were saying, oh, these are science problems for a bunch of things that aren't science problems whatsoever. They're not at all like science. But because science is so popular, because it's so successful, they just want to assume everything under science because it's been so successful. An example of this that I heard somewhere, and I think it was from the philosopher William Lane Craig, and he might have taken it somewhere else. He said, well, why don't we just suppose, for the sake of argument, that you managed to make or somehow get the greatest metal detector that's ever existed. It was so very, very good at detecting metal that it could detect metal anywhere in the universe. And he means the universe with a capital U. That means it would be able to detect metal even beyond the reach of what we can see with our furthest telescopes. That's how good a metal detector it is. So it's a very, very successful metal detector, like the best that could possibly be. And now, because you've got this really awesome metal detector, you then turn around and assume, well, metal is all that exists. There's nothing else in the universe but metal because we've got this really great metal detector. And that's what scientism does. Because science is so very, very good and successful at figuring out the hows of things, at looking at natural laws and determining how matter interacts with each other in natural laws, we then assume that, well, natural laws and matter is all that exists. And we can understand everything through science as a result of that. Now, a lot of the details that I'm going over in this podcast, minus my own stories and anecdotes and things like that, they actually come from a book that J.P. Moreland wrote on this subject called Scientism and Secularism. It's a great book. Highly recommend you read it. J.P. Moreland's a great writer. I had him on the podcast a couple of months ago talking about one of his other recent books. This one is definitely a bit more strictly philosophical, but it's still written at a popular level, so everybody should be able to get something out of it. And so I haven't done this in a while, but if you've been listening to the podcast since I started it, you'll know that way back when I got started, I used to do this thing where I would play clips of other philosophers talking about relevant things because it's easier for, I think, you to listen to people who know more of what they're talking about than me trying to parrot out their words. And it's probably fun to get a break from listening to my voice for a change. And so J.P. Moreland has talked about the key issues he brings up in that book, so I'm going to play a clip of him talking about that here. And also, he tells a couple of stories in the book that he also tells in this clip, and I think it should be more fun for you to just listen to him tell the stories in his own voice as opposed to me just reading them out to you. So here's J.P. Moreland.
Now, there are two forms of scientism. There's strong and weak scientism. Strong scientism is the idea that the hard sciences are the only source of knowledge and truth about reality. Anything outside the hard sciences, the humanities, good Lord, theology and ethics, is simply nothing but personal, private feeling and emotion. And we must tolerate these personal opinions because nobody knows who's right. And there probably isn't anybody right when it comes to ethical and theological issues. As an illustration of this, years ago I was giving an evangelistic talk at a little dessert in a person's home. And one of the Christian brothers said he was inviting his boss, who had a PhD in physics from Hopkins and had been an engineer for about 20-some years, and that he hated Christianity. And he actually went out of his way at work to badger Christians at the coffee pot and go after them for their Christianity. And I said, well, thanks a lot. So I'm there, and I'm at the hors d'oeuvre table, and I can see my friend come in, and he's got an older gentleman with him, and it's obviously his boss. They make a beeline to me, and my friend introduces me to this gentleman, and after we exchange pleasantries, he says, say, I understand you're a philosopher and a theologian. And I said, well, I give it my best effort. And he said, yeah. He said, you know what, I used to be interested in that stuff too when I was a teenager. But when I grew up and matured intellectually, I began to realize that if you can't quantify it and measure it and test it empirically in the lab, it's nothing but hot air and empty opinion. I had a woman come up to me before this gathering saying that a dear friend of hers is undermining and leaving the faith because he believes that science has undermined belief in God. Now, that's what this gentleman was expressing was scientism. Strong scientism. Only the hard sciences can tell us what's true and real and that we can know. It's the scientist who speaks with authority today. Now, the problem with strong scientism is that it's obviously self-refuting. Because the statement, the only thing that you can know and that can be true of reality is what can be tested by the hard sciences, cannot itself be tested by the hard sciences. Therefore, it fails to live up to its own criterion of acceptability. It's like saying there are no sentences of English longer than 3 words. That sentence is self-refuting. And so I let the gentleman talk for about 2 minutes. And he made, I'm going to guess, 20, 30 assertions. And I stopped him and I said, look, I'm confused and I got a problem and you got to help me. I think what you're saying is that if the only thing that you can really know is what can be true is what's tested in the hard sciences. Everything else is hot air and personal opinion. That's what he said. He said exactly. And I said, well, you've uttered about 20 or 30 assertions, and I can't think of a single one of them that could be tested by the empirical sciences. Now, if I'm wrong, would you tell me which assertion you've made that can be tested by the empirical sciences? But if you can't, my dilemma is that what you've been doing for the last 2 minutes is spewing hot air and idle opinion. It was self-refuting. Now, there's another form of scientism that we mention in the book called weak scientism. This allows that there might be some low-grade, justified beliefs outside of science. But it still holds that science is by far the most authoritative specter of knowledge, so that if philosophy and science come into conflict about whether there's a soul or whether you're just your brain, science is going to win that debate because it's got more authority than philosophy, even though philosophy may have a little bit of low-grade authority. Now, there are a lot of difficulties with weak scientism, and I'm going to list 2 of them very quickly. And for one thing, weak scientism does not allow for the stating and justification of its own assumptions, of science's assumptions. Science makes assumptions. It assumes that there's such a thing as truth and that it's a correspondence with reality. It assumes a fairly clear definition of knowledge as a true belief that's based on good evidence and good grounds. But none of these assumptions can be tested by science. Now, science cannot be any stronger than the assumptions on which it's based. Since weak scientism undermines the defense of the assumptions of science. It's actually a foe of science and not a friend, because those assumptions have got to be defended philosophically, not scientifically. So weak scientism undermines science by failing to provide philosophical justification for the assumptions of science themselves. The second problem is that we know things outside of science. And that's just a plain fact. As a matter of fact, we know some things outside of science with far greater rational support than we know in science. For example, there are certain propositions in ethics that we know with more certainty than we know that there are electrons. And I'll give you an illustration of this. After my colon cancer surgery, my stomach wouldn't come back online, so I was in the hospital 9 days. And I saw all kinds of nurses come in on different shifts. And one day this chipper nurse comes in, and she says, "Well, how are you today?" And I said, "I'm hanging in there." And she says, "Well, what do you do for a living?" And I said, "Well, I was actually majored in physical chemistry in my undergraduate work, but then I went in and did a THM in theology and an MA and a PhD in philosophy, ultimate USC, and I'm a philosophy professor." And there was a puzzled look on her face. It's actually happened. I said, "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to predict what you're thinking right now, and you tell me if I'm wrong. What I believe you're thinking is, gosh, you started off in a field of study where there are hard facts, and you can really know whether you're right and wrong, and you went over to this stuff where nobody knows who's right, and there's just a bunch of opinions, and it's largely just about kind of saying whatever you want." She said, "That's exactly what I was thinking." And I said, "Well, I got to tell you, you're dead wrong about that. In fact, it may be the opposite. I know an ethical claim with more certainty than I know that there are electrons." And she looked at me like I'd parsed every Hebrew verb in the Old Testament. I mean, she was just... she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, take the claim, torturing little babies for the fun of it is wrong. I have more rational support for that than I do that there's a belief in electrons, and here's why." I said, "Do you know anything about the history of the electron?" "No." "Well, I do. I've studied it from J.J. Thomson all the way up the debate between German wave theorists about the electron and the British particle theorists, all the way to the Bohr electron, up to the quantum electron. And if you ask me, do I believe in electrons, I'm going to have to ask you, which one did you have in mind? Now, you probably mean the present one. But look, is it beyond reasonable doubt that 50 years from now we will no longer believe that the electron as we currently conceive of it exists, given the history of the electron, and we might believe something completely different exists? Is that conceivable to you? Well, sure. Now, I said it's not conceivable to me that in 50 years we will find new evidence that will make the assertion torturing little babies for the fun of it is wrong rationally incorrect. Now, don't get me wrong. I can imagine a situation where everybody in society would believe in torturing little babies for fun, but I can't think of rational evidence that would come in that would make that assertion obviously an irrational one. Thus, I have greater certainty in an ethical claim than I do in a scientific claim. My point? I don't know, but it was an interesting story. Now, my point is that there are areas of knowledge in theology and in ethics that we know with greater certainty than some of the assertions in science, and it goes both ways. There are sources of knowledge outside of science, and we need to learn to live with that fact.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Moreland's a pretty good speaker as well as a good writer. Now, he makes many of these same points that he made in that little speech there in the book, so I'm not going to rehash the points he went into. Just go through some more notes here. It's important to note that scientism is not really a doctrine of science, although many people who advocate for it in either the weak or the strong sense will probably claim to you it is, but it's not. It's actually a doctrine of philosophy, and specifically a doctrine of epistemology. Now, epistemology, I've alluded to it before here on the podcast, it's the type of philosophy that studies questions of knowledge. How do you know things? How are you justified in knowing things? and it can get extraordinarily complicated, but we don't need to get into the complicated aspects of it here. So with that understanding of how to categorize things, I hope you can clearly and easily quickly see that any claim about what is and is not legitimate knowledge and how you arrive at it is just going to fall under philosophy and epistemology, not science. Science is a discipline that is a little bit further up from the foundation than philosophy and epistemology. If you think of human knowledge as kind of like a branching tree, you're going to find science very close to the bottom, very close to the roots, but you're going to find it sitting on top of things like philosophy and epistemology. And that's because science actually depends on some philosophical and even metaphysical assumptions in order to do its work. It depends on things like the idea that reality is consistent. This is sometimes called the Copernican principle, but the idea is the laws of physics are the same on Earth as they are on Mars, so if we go to Mars, we can expect gravity to work there too. And we can even expect gravity to work in the far distant reaches of the universe that are millions of light years away. And that's how astronomers are able to do calculations and all these kind of things. Because if, say, the speed of light was different millions of light years away, then they wouldn't be able to do all the calculations and figure out things like they do. And it depends on things like the rules and laws of logic, the law of identity, the law of the excluded middle, the law of non-contradiction. If it was possible for water to be both H2O and not H2O, well, you couldn't really do science with it. So science depends upon all these other principles and theories and axioms that it can't itself turn around and prove because it depends on them. Your house depends on having a foundation if it's going to be a good house. But you can't then turn around and use your house to build your foundation. That you need to have the foundation for the house. And likewise, science simply can't prove things like the validity of the laws of logic, the Copernican principle, and many other basic assumptions like that are grounded in logic, philosophy, and even metaphysics. Because I'm firmly convinced, and there have been a few philosophers who argued against this, but I'm pretty firmly convinced that Aristotle's laws of logic, the laws of logic, they're metaphysical principles. They transcend the physical. They're not just about physical reality, they're about everything. We can apply them in philosophy, theology, and any other category you can think of because the law of non-contradiction is always going to be valid. You can't have both A and non-A at the same time and in the same context and in the same sense. So a claim like the only things that can be known and proven true are things that are quantifiable and can be repeatable and experimented on, which is kind of a scientific claim, maybe a little bit stronger than they would typically want to make it. But a claim like that doesn't fall under a doctrine of science. It falls under philosophy and epistemology. So one way to think about it is they're making a category error there. But it's worse than that, and this is something Moreland goes through in his book. Claims of scientism, if they're the strong type, are self-refuting. Because a claim like the hard sciences alone have the intellectual authority to give us knowledge of life, well, that statement is self-refuting. Because that statement doesn't fall under the province of a hard science. It's not something that statement isn't something you can put in a lab, it isn't something you can test, it isn't something you can use the scientific method on. It isn't even something you could use like one of the soft sciences like archaeology or sociology or psychology on. It's self-refuting. The statement sets up a standard that is the only legitimate knowledge is stuff that comes from the hard sciences, and then it fails to meet its own standard because it's making a claim that can't be submitted or categorized or evaluated by the hard sciences. And so what Moreland there would term strong scientism is self-refuting, and almost always so. It's probably for that reason that the late great and absolutely amazing philosopher Dallas Willard said of this, the idea that knowledge, and of course reality, is limited to the world of the natural sciences is the single most destructive idea on the stage of life today. Okay, so I'm coming up on the 45-minute mark here, so I'm pushing time, and I've still got quite a bit of notes to go through, so I'm just going to try and blow through them as quickly as I can here and hopefully get all the content done. So, Moreland notes in the book that one of the major problems for Christians such as myself with scientism is not just the philosophical, but that it actually makes religion to be at best a private superstition. Because naturally, if the hard sciences or the natural sciences are the only legitimate means to knowledge, that excludes all religion and makes it at best something like a private personal preference. Like, some people will prefer chocolate ice cream over vanilla. There's nothing really right or wrong about that. That's just a preference, and it's certainly not something you should actually fight over, because it's not objectively true what's better, even though it's chocolate. And it makes religion like that. And so naturally, if you're at all like me, and you think, well, some religious claims are true and some are false, you should resist that. And really, even people who are non-Christians and atheists should resist that, because in order for them to say that my claim that Jesus Christ rose from the dead is false, well, there has to be a truth or a falsity of the matter. It can't just be a private superstition type thing. It has to be, is it true or is it false? If you're going to claim, no, Phil, you're wrong, Christ didn't rise from the dead, well, it has to be true or false. And scientism excludes that option from you, because that's not something you can look at with the hard sciences or the natural sciences. And for this reason as well, what scientism has done, because it's become so pervasive in our culture, as I hope the examples Moreland gave and the examples I gave illustrate, is because of that, it's pushed Christianity outside the plausibility structure of most people. That is, they go around thinking that science has disproven a lot of these things when it hasn't, because they're applying bad standards of evidence, making category errors and things along those lines, and that's what they've been told. So Christianity isn't even something that they really consider. Because how could they consider it? It's anti-science, at least according to what they've been told, and according to what the press and the media, which badly misunderstands both science and religion, tells them. And for this reason, there was a shift in knowledge. And for this reason, there's been a shift from basing religious claims on knowledge to regarding religion and any spirituality as simply accepted by blind faith. In the book, Moreland gives an example. He tells a story of how after 9/11, Oprah got a bunch of people on there to talk about what to do about all these things, and she basically said, go with whatever works for you and find your spirituality, and that's going to help you out. Which is an absolutely crazy claim in any other category or any other thing. If the problem was that you were suffering from cancer, I certainly don't think Oprah would say, well, go with whatever remedy works for you. It's those oncologists over there, they have this opinion that chemotherapy might help you. That natural food remedies over there thinks that abstaining from sugar and taking these essential oils will help you. Whatever works for you. Well, no, she certainly wouldn't do that. And his point is that she was making the assumption that religion and spirituality is not based on knowledge, but medicine is, or at least I assume she would think medicine is, because everybody thinks that in our society. Well, almost everybody. The people who are anti-vaxxers don't, but let's not deal with that right now. So, now, if something like scientism is true, then it does follow that Christianity is an outdated, bigoted superstition, and it follows that for pretty much all religion and quite a bit of philosophy too. And Moreland's got a quote in here from Robert B. Reich, who's a former professor at Harvard University and was the Secretary of Labor under the Clinton administration. And this guy says it quite blatantly. He says, the greatest conflict of the 21st century will be between modern civilization and anti-modernists, between those who believe in the primacy of the individual and those who believe that human beings owe their allegiance and identity to a higher authority, between those who give priority to life in this world and those who believe that human life is a mere preparation for an existence beyond life. And this is where Moreland has it italicized or highlighted. Between those who believe in science, reason, and logic, and those who believe that the truth... Between those who believe in science, reason, and logic, and those who believe that truth is revealed through scripture and religious dogma. And so he's clearly saying, well, there's a conflict here. And so Reich is clearly saying, well, there's a conflict here. And there is a conflict between scientism and religion, but there isn't a conflict between actual science and religion, as I hope I've been able... as I hope I've been able to demonstrate by going through the podcast, and as I hope I've been able to explain when we're going through this, and what I hope you picked up from Moreland is, scientism is not logical or rational. It's actually quite a foolish way of looking at things. Now, a further point that Moreland brings up in the book, and this is related but not necessarily caused by scientism, but I think the implication is this has helped allow the rise of scientism, is that there's been a fragmentation of knowledge at universities and people who are in higher level disciplines. And what I mean by that is, your average geologist doesn't know very much about biology. Your average biologist probably doesn't know a great deal about physics, or like high-level physics, and so on and so forth. And you even find that in philosophy. Your average guy who does philosophy of religion, like me, I know a little bit about epistemology, and I like to study modal logic, but I'm pretty inept at, say, the philosophy of aesthetics, or something along those lines. Your average moral philosopher probably hasn't done much in philosophy of religion. Your average philosopher in modal logic also probably hasn't done much in philosophy of religion. And that's something to consider when you hear people claiming things like, well, most philosophers don't believe in God. I think that statistic's probably true, but most philosophers actually haven't engaged with, say, philosophical arguments for the existence of God beyond what they heard in their intro to philosophy class in their first undergraduate class, because they go on and specialize in certain other things like philosophy and business like political philosophy, modal logic, general logic, and philosophy of math, and so on and so forth. So they just don't engage with it. There's a fragmentation in knowledge where a lot of these disciplines can't really talk to each other even if they want to, because they're so highly specialized. In point of fact, it'd be probably wiser to refer to many of these universities as multiversities rather than universities, because they aren't unified. Now, the reason why this is possibly something that's enabled scientism to thrive is because all these disciplines are so disconnected, they now have to just more or less take each other's word for it when they go outside their field. There really aren't very many places where they give you a true liberal arts education anymore, where you know and have a good foundation in many different disciplines and can see how it's all interconnected. So naturally, if you go get a PhD in geology and learn a great deal about that, you probably didn't learn very much about philosophy because the university didn't require you to, and why would you if they don't require you to? And you probably didn't learn very much about epistemology because, again, why would they require you to? So then when you hear somebody claiming something like, well, the hard sciences are the only or the best way to get knowledge, you're going to be more open to that, more sympathetic to that, more likely to take that's true because you were never taught why that's wrong. And hey, it's what you're doing all the time. You're going into a lab and doing testing on rocks. You're going and digging things up. You're doing the hard science work. You've seen it works. You've seen it's pragmatic. Why wouldn't you think that? Whereas somebody who had a greater grounding in the liberal arts education, who had to take some basic philosophy and logic, who had to take some who had to do broader coursework and gain some broader knowledge, they would hear that and be a little more inclined to think, hey, there's something up with this. And that's one of the things that I actually liked a great deal about Evangel University, where I went and got my undergraduate degree, is, although I don't think they did it perfectly, they were really trying to do something like a traditional liberal arts education in the students there. They required everybody to take some philosophy. They required everybody to take some humanities courses. They required everybody to take some theology and things like that. And I think you can debate how successful they were, but the idea was, let's get our students a well-rounded, grounded foundation, and then they can work their way up from there. And if universities still did that instead of being so highly specialized, it's maybe wouldn't be quite as likely that we're stuck with this bad category of scientism everywhere. So That's pretty much the extent of what I wanted to say on scientism. As I said, a great deal of this is based on Moreland's book on scientism. If you want to know how somebody who is not a Christian philosopher would respond to Moreland, he and Stephen Law did a little debate about his book on scientism on the British podcast, on the British show that's also a podcast called Unbelievable, and they went back and forth on that, and you can listen to that if you want to hear some criticism of it. Basically, Law's criticism was more or less that he doesn't see scientism as prevalent in the culture as Moreland does. Law conceded to him, strong scientism is self-refuting, weak scientism is problematic, but I think the examples you showed in your book just aren't scientism, and that's more or less what they argued about. And I remember thinking as I was reading the book that there's probably a lot more instances of weak scientism in our culture and more examples of weak scientism than there are of strong scientism, because strong scientism is just so obviously problematic that most people avoid it. But I think there is a general spirit of weak scientism in the culture because people just tend to assume that, hey, science settles things. Science often functions as a conversation stopper. If somebody says to you, well, hey, this is what science has shown, they're trying in a certain sense to end the conversation and the debate. Now, maybe not maliciously so, maybe not in bad faith, but that's the way it often functions, which I think is a sign of weak scientism. So, that's the extent of the podcast for this week. What do you think about it? Write in and let me know. What do you think about scientism? Do you see it everywhere as Moreland and I do? Do you see weak scientism all over the place like I do all the time when I'm talking to people? Write in and let me know what you think. You can reach me for any kind of comment or critique at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. And I've started a Facebook group for the podcast called The Examined Life with Phil. Just do a search for that and you'll be able to find it. I try and post funny, interesting, relevant things on the Facebook group, so it's not just me putting the podcast out there every Friday, but I do that too. So write and let me know what you think, and if you enjoy the podcast, you enjoyed this episode, share it on your social media, give it a rating on whatever podcast app you use, and thanks again for listening. I will be back again next week, wherein I will talk about the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.